Hello YouTube. I'm reading through the book of 1 Samuel, and I'm going to try to illustrate how the timeline presented doesn't make any sense. I'm going to start with 1 Samuel 9 verse 2. Saul is introduced as a young man who's still living in the house of Kish. In verse 3, Kish asks Saul to go look for donkeys which have strayed. In verse 20, Samuel tells Saul about the donkeys which were lost 3 days ago. So we're now 3 days since Saul's introduction. In verses 25 through 26, Saul sleeps in the town where Samuel lives, and then he gets up. So we're now 4 days since his introduction. In verse 27, Saul and Samuel go outside of the town, and Samuel anoints Saul. And then in chapter 10, verses 2 through 8, the same day, Samuel gives him 4 different signs which will illustrate that the Lord has anointed Saul as king. The first sign is that he's going to meet 2 men by Rachel's tomb at Zelzah. Even though Genesis 35:19 through 20 says that she was buried near Bethlehem. They are going to say that the donkeys he went to seek have been found. The second sign will be by the oak of Tabor. 3 men going up to God will meet Saul there. They'll be carrying 3 kids, loaves of bread, and a skin of wine. They'll greet Saul and give him loaves of bread. The third sign at Gileath-elohim is that a band of prophets will be coming from the shrine with a harp, tambourine, flute, and lyre. They will be prophesying. I'll make a separate video about the prophesying. And the Spirit of the Lord will possess Saul, and he will prophesy. And then the fourth sign is at Gilgal. Saul is supposed to wait at Gilgal for 7 days. Samuel will go down to him and present burnt offerings and offer sacrifices of well-being, and Samuel will show Saul what to do. Then in chapter 10 verse 9, as Saul turned away to leave Samuel, God gave him another heart, and all these signs were fulfilled that day. Were they? In verses 10 through 13, sign number 3 is fulfilled. Saul meets the band of prophets, and he does prophesy, and he goes home after he prophesied. Then in verses 14 through 16, Saul's uncle, not his father, asks him where he went. And in verse 16, Saul says that Samuel told him that the donkeys had been found, where Samuel gave him a sign that 2 men by Rachel's tomb at Zelzah were supposed to tell him that. So that's not a fulfillment of sign number 1. In verses 17 through 26, Samuel summoned the people of Israel at Mizpah and proclaimed Saul king. So this is still 4 days after Saul's introduction. In 1 Samuel 11 chapter 1, it says, 1 month later, Nahash the Ammonite besieged Jabesh-Gilead. So this is now 1 month and 4 days after Saul's introduction. In chapter 11 verse 3, the elders of Jabesh said to Nahash, give us 7 days respite that we may send messengers through all the territory of Israel. Then if there is no one to save us, we will give ourselves up to you. So let's say that they were given all 7 days. So this is now 1 month, 11 days after Saul's introduction. In verse 11, it says, the next day Saul put the people he gathered together into 3 companies, and he cut down the Ammonites. So this is now 1 month and 12 days after he's been introduced. And interestingly enough, in verse 12, the people said to Samuel, Who is it that said, shall Saul reign over us? Give them to us so that we may put them to death. Did they forget that Saul was proclaimed king 8 days earlier? In verses 14 through 15 of the same day, Saul's kingship is renewed. And then the entire chapter 12, again, the same day, Samuel gives a kind of farewell address. So we're still 1 month and 12 days after Saul's introduction. One interesting thing about the farewell address is that in verse 12, Samuel says that Nahash caused Israel to ask for a king. Where if you read 1 Samuel chapter 8 verses 1 through 5, the reason that Israel asked for a king was because Samuel was old and his sons didn't walk in his ways. And then we get to chapter 13. In the Septuagint, verse 1 is actually missing. And I've looked through several different translations of the Masoretic text, and the closest one to what's actually there is the King James Version. And that reads, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel. So let's be generous and say that Saul's been reigning for 3 years. So this is now 3 years, 1 month, and 12 days after his character had been introduced as a young man. Let's read verses 2 through 3 of chapter 13. Saul chose 3,000 out of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent home to their tents. Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, Let the Hebrews hear. An adult Jonathan out of complete nowhere. Now, this is 3 years, 1 month, and 12 days after Saul was introduced as a young man still living in the house of Kish. And now he has a completely grown son fighting alongside with him. Does this make sense? Let's continue on here. Verses 5 through 8. The Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and troops like the sand on the seashore in multitude. They came up and encamped at Michmash to the east of Beth-aven. When the Israelites saw that they were in distress, for the troops were hard pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns. Some Hebrews crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. He waited for 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people began to slip away from Saul. So now he waits for 7 days. Prophecy number 4, which Samuel said that Saul would have fulfilled 3 years, 1 month, and 4 days earlier. And prophecies 1 through 2 remain unfulfilled, by the way. So this timeline contains a whole bunch of irreconcilable errors.